Well, welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio on Sagan and 60. You know, that was a fascinating conversation about the pandemic and how we could have and should have expected it and known what was coming and planned far better for it. And so I'm now joined by Professor Gail Krantzberg, who is a professor of engineering and public policy at McMaster University. And she tells me that, that frankly, there's a better way of testing the prevalence of the virus and doing it not by just testing people, but by testing our sewage systems. Professor Krantzberg, thanks for joining us. How are you tonight?
I'm well, thank you.
So what is this? We're testing sewage systems?
Yeah, absolutely we are. If you have the virus, you will shed virus particles in your feces. Those go washing into the wastewater treatment plant. And laboratories all around the world have been detecting virus particles in wastewater treatment. And what's so interesting about it is, so it gives you a real snapshot of how many people are sick, or rather how big the sickness is in a community dumping into that one wastewater treatment plant. You can,
but like for wastewaters in Peel, for an example, I think there's one wastewater for like Mississauga, Brampton, and some parts of Caledon. Like, how are you going to know where it is?
So you can actually go up what's called a sewer shed. So there's a whole network of sewers that connect into a wastewater treatment plant. So if you sample in different neighborhoods, as the sewage is moving from that neighborhood down into the central plant, you can look at neighborhood 1 and neighborhood 2, and you can see you've got a signature of virus in neighborhood 1, but you don't in neighborhood 2. And then you look at neighborhood 1 and you say, what might be going on there? And lo and behold, for example, I'm not predicting, but for example, there's 3 elementary schools and there's none in neighborhood 2, or there's a long-term care facility in neighborhood 1, but not in neighborhood 2. And it gives you the knowledge then to go into that neighborhood where the signature is high and penetrate and say, now what's going on here? Have there been cases here that we're not seeing somewhere else? And then you can do more focused control and lockdown and quarantine of local locations rather than shutting down the whole Peel region.
Is this as a replacement to testing people because what, asymptomatic people don't get tested often enough?
It's not a replacement. We listen to our medical officers and our physicians, and the more different tools we have, the better off we are. The more universities there are testing or developing tests for wastewater, the better. We should continue to test people. Absolutely, we should. But this is a fail-safe, if you will. If we're not catching asymptomatic people, if we're not making testing mandatory, what about vaccines? Let's say we vaccinate everybody and we assume they will stay immune. Well, we don't know how long they'll stay immune. So if we look at the wastewater and all of a sudden we see the virus biomarker coming up again, even though we've had vaccines, it's telling us something about the community, about the respread of that in the community. So testing is absolutely necessary, but not everybody will be tested, and it's good, but it has its flaws. That's not to say it shouldn't be done. But this gives us a real-time look. Even before you might see an outbreak in a community, you will see it in the wastewater. So it's a real-time, and it's non-invasive. It's a non-invasive way of measuring people's health.
How does the test actually work? You know, the issue with the nasal swab is that, you know, it takes 3 days to a week to get the results back because it has to go to some central place. How do you actually do the testing, and how do you analyze the test?
So right now at McMaster, we're looking at a rapid deployable test that's cost effective. There aren't a lot of those out yet. There are some fairly sophisticated tests that are quite expensive, but the turnaround is within days. But not all municipalities can afford that. So one of the things we're focusing on is, if all the best labs around the country are coming up with a fantastic test that Caledon can't afford doing, well, what's the point? What we're doing is working with a consortium of municipal and non-municipal laboratories saying, what is your capability? What is your gap? What infrastructure do you need? And talk about investment in infrastructure out of COVID-19. Getting every single municipality, big or small, remote or regional, to have the ability to do these tests, that should be an investment that we look at our federal government for, talking about equity across the country. So So there's a few phases here. One is that tests can be fairly rapid. We're looking at some biomarkers, almost like a litmus paper test, seeing if that's going to work. We're looking at microscopic tests. So can you actually visualize the virus? So this is pretty new. I mean, my colleague, Dr. Jawed, likes to say we're building the airplane and flying it at the same time. Everything is very new with COVID. So we're looking and reaching out to a wide range of practitioners to share best practices, to share sampling protocols, analysis protocols, to find the most cost-effective, most rapid test that is non-invasive, that could tell us what's going on in our community.
Okay, so tell me logistically what happens. Does some scientist from McMaster take a van and drive to 10 different places in Peel and put a bucket in a sewage thing and then come back and test it in a lab in Mac? What logistically happens?
Oh Lord, no. Oh Lord, no. We are not the keeper of the samples. What we have right now, as we're developing the testing protocols, we have at least, I think, 10 municipal and about 8 to 10 non-municipal laboratories. They're sampling their wastewater treatment plants as they always have, but they're storing their samples. So they're taking large volume samples, no change in protocol, no change in operating procedure, but they're storing them, they're refrigerating them until a time when their lab or the lab they use has the ability to do the tests. This gives us, what's interesting about it is we want to build local capacity for every city, every municipality to do their own thing. This is not creating, it would be a nightmare if McMaster was to say, send us all your samples from all over the province. We would never have the capacity to do that. This is building in-house labs or whatever municipality, whatever private labs they do, building their ability to do the tests every single day, every single week, whatever frequency they want, without relying on some centralized academic laboratory to do the work for them. We want every municipality to have the ability to protect themselves by developing with them. This is co-developing the sampling, co-developing the methods. What works for one municipality may be a bit different from what works for another one, but on the ground sampling happens locally, it's stored locally, and it's analyzed locally.
How long until you think you're in the market implementing?
That's an interesting question. We have a very sizable request to the province of Ontario right now that are considering it. We hope we'll get that grant to hire on some graduate students, buy some laboratory equipment, do some testing protocols. If we hear within the next few weeks, then the sampling has just begun this week. Municipalities have, so we're just starting on a sort of a pilot scale testing. Samples have started this week before schools open, so we have a baseline before schools open. The full opening up of this project could take a few months, perhaps less, perhaps more, but we will continue to push for federal and provincial grants to make this thing happen, because we know that the interest is out there. We've had a tremendous number of people who learn about this come to us directly without us even having to reach out to them. So that we know the need is there. We know the interest is there to build capacity locally, to build a system-wide structure that enables every community to be safe. So I'm hoping I can get back in touch with you in the next month or two and give you an update on where we're at and how far we've gone along. And
you think that this test from the sewage of the feces would test positive when someone is asymptomatic?
So it depends. So yes, maybe not everybody, but if you're asymptomatic and it gets into digestive tract, even though you don't feel sick, you will shed it. If you're asymptomatic and it just goes through your nasal passages, for example, and you cough it out and never gets into your digestive tract, you won't. So some people who are asymptomatic certainly will. The science isn't there yet to know what proportion of asymptomatic people shed it, just that some proportion does.
So this may be a little bit challenging for you to answer, but I just chatted with a union leader of a teaching facility, of a teachers association, and she's really quite worried about what's going to happen in schools. And the example we went through, and we were talking about some of the schools in the southern United States that opened up in mid-August, that that they closed, but they probably closed way too late. And the reason why is because it took a while for someone to become symptomatic. And by that time they became symptomatic, they infected a whole bunch of other people, and a whole bunch of other people infected a whole bunch of other people, et cetera, et cetera. So you can't respond quickly enough to close the school down. And by the time you've got 400, 500 infected people, that's the time that you finally close the school down. Would this be a solution where you could actually test the sewage coming out from a school and know if there's a chance of infection going crazy within the school?
It's a hugely insightful question, Brian. Yeah, the answer is yes. The question is, not question, what needs to happen is that the portals, the sewer covers that are close enough to the school need to be accessed by staff, probably municipal staff, that would sample there on a routine basis and be able to analyze there. I think in the short term that's going to be complicated because the testing needs to go to a laboratory. If we actually have a biosensor that you can just put into the sewer at where the school's effluent is coming out, that told you positive or negative, that would be fantastic. That's still in the works. We don't have it yet. But over time, I think that's a very pragmatic way of proceeding, because this is not the back to school. It's not a one-time only. We may be back to school. We may see the same thing happen in January. We may see the same thing happen next year or the year after as vaccines come and go. So to be able to do that systematically in the effluent from each school would be brilliant and could shut down the spread much faster than waiting for 50, 60, 100, 200 kids to get sick.
Connected question, and again, you may not be able to answer this, but it's interesting. In SARS back 15 years ago in 2003, or 17 years ago, I guess it was, there was apartment buildings and condominiums where people were getting sick from the sewage within their the sewage system within the condominiums. I guess I didn't realize that the virus was so present in the feces. Can you get sick from the sewage in condominiums and apartment buildings?
Yeah, one would ask, can you get sick if you get a sewage overflow into the lake also, because it goes into the air, and then what? What we don't know, because it requires a very highly sensitive laboratory with a lot of like hazmat gear to test for a live virus. So what people have been doing is taking the sample from the wastewater treatment plant, making sure none of the pathogens are viable, and then looking to see what they have. So we don't know if the virus that we find in the wastewater plant is viable, can make people sick, or is just a fragment and cannot. That's an unknown right now, because you really need a biohazardous lab at a very high restriction level for people to actually measure and see if they can get the virus to grow. That's hugely dangerous. So all the sampling that I've seen so far around the world has made sure that the sample is innocuous, so that you can visualize, you can see the RNA, you can visualize that the virus is present, but we don't know if it's alive or not.
We're chatting tonight with Professor Gail Krantzberg from McMaster's School of Engineering. She's a professor in engineering and public policy. We're talking about testing sewage for COVID-19 as a sort of a early warning system. We're going to take a break for some messages. Stay with us. We're going to be right back. Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. You know, a fascinating conversation. We heard from the head of pandemic research at U of T, a lot of information in regards to what we should have known about the pandemic, what lots of people did know about the pandemic or the potential of a pandemic, and that we didn't do, and other things that we should be doing right now. And now we're chatting with Professor Gail Krantzberg from McMaster University, the School of Engineering, professor in engineering and public policy, about one of the potential things we could do. Professor Krantzberg, is this a solution just for now, or is this a potential solution that makes sense long-term for pandemics in the future?
This is a long-term solution. One of the reasons why we're very focused on building the ability of municipalities and their associated laboratories, whether they be private or public, is because this is a pandemic now. It may go away, it may come back. There may be other pandemics that come into the future. And if we have the infrastructure in place to have this done locally, sampling is more frequent, the ability to respond in a neighborhood is there. rather than trying to centralize some university laboratory or government laboratory, accepting all the samples and maybe getting 1 a month or 2 a month. So this is really for now, for the present. It will evolve over time, but it's also well into the future for the next, I could see for the next unforeseeable future, that this would be infrastructure that would be valuable for human health.
So I read this fascinating study that said Google was far better, or Facebook was far better at predicting when the flu grew in different communities, because everyone would be talking about that they were at home rather than reporting into work and things like that. So it sounds like this is sort of another in the community way of better testing the prevalence of any kind of virus.
It is, and it's really community focused. That's why we have this consortium that we're building of, like I said, we have First Nations on board, we have remote communities on board, and then we have regional municipalities and large cities on board. So it's everybody's trying to help each other figure out the best way to do this at the most cost-effective way to keep people safe now and for future pandemics, as you said.
I think we need some solutions like this. I interviewed a company out of Ottawa, Spartan Bioscience, that had a testing for DNA that was going to be a quick, rapid test for COVID-19. I've heard people talk about the potential solution as a saliva solution, but all of those are going to be based on when people feel symptomatic and then do something. And so, your solution is as you say, an early warning system.
Thank you. I think so, because again, even if you feel ill and you get tested and it's negative, you may still be sick. It's just you have a false negative. And the virus particles don't lie. They're either there or they're not there. And if they're there, there's sick people in the community.
We're chatting tonight with Professor Gail Krantzberg of the School of Engineering in McMaster University. She's a professor of engineering and public policy. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. I really appreciate it.
You're very welcome.
We're going to take a break and come back in just a minute for a couple of final comments. Thanks so much. Well, welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour, Saga 960. We're chatting tonight about COVID-19 and the pandemic. We first of all interviewed a professor from University of Toronto that is a pandemic expert, and excellent information. And I effectively think what he said is that we should have been expecting this, and that lots of people were expecting it, but the governments and the general population weren't. And that, I'd mentioned that, last time this happened was 100 years ago in the Spanish flu. And he said, no, we've actually had, 10 or so of these pandemics, maybe not as lethal as this one, maybe not as widespread as this one, but since 2003, since SARS. And then chatting with this professor from the School of Engineering in McMaster, who talked about we need an early warning system, that the testing that we have right now isn't effective enough. And I guess I wanted to conclude by giving you my own point of view on this topic. I think that we should be more prepared for things that are happening. And it comes to, I think that, the question that I had with one of the emergency preparedness experts I had on my show earlier, that said, we've got to ask the what if question more often. What if we get a pandemic? What if we have an emergency? What if we lose our job? What if there's an explosion? What if? Because it's those what if things that we're just never ready enough for, and then end up messing us up big time. And you can see the impact of the blast in Beirut, Lebanon. You can see the impact of a tornado in the southern United States. You can see the impact of a worldwide pandemic. You can see the impact of an economic crisis. And too often we end up just planning for, linear progression, good times, nothing changes. And if we know anything, it's that stuff changes and stuff happens, and we got to be ready for it. One of my favorite books, when I was a teenager, was James Clavell and Noble House. And the protagonist there, actually, I think it was Shogun, I can't remember, but the protagonist said one of the keys to life was having F-off money. You had to have a little bit of a safety stock of cash so that you could withstand a problem. I don't think we often enough think about resilience, personal resilience, family resilience, community resilience, national resilience, how we get through tough times, because bad stuff does happen, and it happens on an ongoing basis. And we got to be ready for it and prepared for it and be able to withstand it. And some of that is personal strength and personal confidence, personal resilience. But a lot of it is societal resilience. And we need that in our sewage treatment plants. We need that in our healthcare system. We need that in our economy. We just need it. And so let's build resilience. Thanks for joining me. That's the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I'm on every night, 6 o'clock on 960 AM. You can stream me online at www.saga960am.ca, or you can get me after the fact, my video casts and podcasts on my website, briancrombie.com. Thanks so much. I really enjoy chatting with you every night. Good night.